Ciao friends and welcome to a new video from SQL BI. In this video, I want to show you a couple of techniques that you can use to reduce the number of items that are visible in a slicer. Now, sometimes you create a slicer and that contains a lot of values. For example, you can create a slicer with the subcategories of a product and we have a lot of subcategories. A suitable technique in order to reduce the number of values that are visible to users is that of creating a hierarchical slicer. So you place the category and then the subcategory, so users will not struggle in finding the value they are searching for. However, sometimes the columns that you want to use for this structure are coming from different tables, and therefore this is not always an option. You cannot create a hierarchy slicer. You need to create two tables and then build a suitable set of relationships. And again, sometimes you cannot create the relationship. For example, if the values in the slicer are coming from a calculation group, so you have a calculation group with a lot of calculation items, and you want to reduce the number of calculation items visible for some specific users, then you cannot even create the relationship. And if that is the case, you need to write some DAX code. I'm going to show you all the details, but first, let's start looking at the issue with the demo. As I said, you might have a slicer containing the subcategories, as I have here on the screen. We have a lot of subcategories, and users might struggle in finding the value they are searching for. So a very good technique is that of placing the category before. If I place both category and subcategory on the same slicer, first, I see just the categories, and only when I expand the category, I can look at the different values. This makes it much easier for users to find the value they are searching for. However, the scenario I want to show you is a bit more complex, because this technique works provided that the columns you place in the table, they are coming from the same table or from a table with a suitable set of relationships. The scenario I want to show is this one. I have different brands. So first, let's get rid of the categories and we place the brands in the slicer. I have a set of brands. I have different users, and different users are interested in different sets of brands. So the two users are Marco and Alberto. You see that both they are interested in a datum. But then Marco is interested in a set of values, and then Alberto is interested in a different set of brands. So there is an overlap between the brands of Marco and the brands of Alberto. In other words, in more technical words, we say that there is a many-to-many relationship between brands and users. Many brands are visible to a user, and a user can see many brands. So I already created the table that contains the relationship between brand and user. And you can see it's here. It's just a simple calculated table that contains static values, but of course you can use a table loaded from somewhere else. And this doesn't go away. Anyway, the content of the table is visible here. Then you create a slicer and you place the slicer here in a different slicer. You cannot place the slicer in the same, so you cannot create a hierarchical slicer if they are coming from two tables that do not have the correct set of relationships. The thing is, if I click on user here and here, that filters this table because the table is coming from the brand selection table, but nothing happens to the other slicer. In order to make cross-filtering happen, I need to create a relationship. So we have the brand selection table, we have the product table, and we create a relationship based on the brand. Based on the brand. Now, brand is neither a column in brand selection, nor it is a column in product. Therefore, the relationship needs to be a many-to-many relationship. And Power BI warns you about this. The relationship is going to be many-to-many. Not only you have a warning because it's a many-to-many, you also need to choose the cross-filter direction. The cross-filter direction can be single or both. We are not going to use both, and we need to choose between the two single directions. We can choose product to filter brand selection or brand selection to filter product. And guess what? We want brand selection to filter products. Just click on OK. And now the magic happens. When you click on the user, you only see the brands that are visible for that specific user. Now, keep in mind, this is not security. I'm not securing the brand, the product table through the brand selection. That's only a convenient way for users or to select the brands that are more interesting to them. If you want to apply security, then you need to follow a completely different approach that is based on roles. This is just an easy way to reduce the number of values. However, despite working nice, this technique has a limitation because it requires you to build the relationship, and sometimes you cannot create the relationship. For example, if the values that you place in the slicer are not coming from a table, but they are coming from a calculation group, then you cannot create a relationship, because one of the limitations of calculation groups is that you cannot create a relationship with calculation group. Despite looking like tables, calculation groups are not really tables. So I have created a calculation group in this model. Let me reduce brand selection and product. I have created a calculation group. Now, this calculation group doesn't actually do anything. You can see I have created with Tabular Editor. It contains 7 calculation items. None of them is doing anything. They're just returning the selected measure. And if I remove the brand from this slicer and I place the calculation group, where is it? Calculation group, the item on the calculation group, I see C1 through C7. And I'm not going to use this table for the selection. I have created a different table. Let me show you the other table, which is item selection. Item selection builds a relationship between the calculation item and the different users. You see that C1 is interesting for both Marco and Alberto, and then the other values are split between Marco and Alberto in different ways. So the same structure we have seen before, but now we have a calculation group. So I'm going to use the user from item selection in the first slicer. Let me get rid of this user, and instead we are using the user from item selection. And again, if I click on Alberto or Marco, nothing happens. The thing is, I can no longer use the same technique I used before. Yes, I already have item selection and calculation group, but this time I cannot create the relationship between item selection and the calculation group. If I try to do that, I get an error that says that the relationship involves calculation group table cal group, which is not allowed. Therefore, the technique we used before, that is not an option now. But what we can do is create a specific measure that acts as a filter on the slicer, and the measure will read the user that has been selected in the first slicer and then make visible only the calculation items which are visible to that specific user. Let's write the code together. We need to create a new measure, and we call this measure item filter. Item filter first needs to retrieve the selection made at the user level. So we store in a variable the current user selection. Let's get rid of the mouse. And that is just values of the selection table, which is item selection user. Actually, we are not interested in the user. We are interested in the calculation items that are visible to the user. So not user, but item. That returns C1, C2, C4, all the items that are visible for the specific user that has been selected. Then we need to find the current value of the calculation item that is being shown inside the slicer. And that is as simple as using selected value. We create a current calc item, and that is the selected value of, this time we use the calculation group item. So we have the current item, the one that should be visible or not in the slicer. We have the ones that are visible because of the selection made by the user. We just check that one is inside the other. So we create the result, and we check if the current calculation item belongs to the current user selection. This returns a Boolean value. So that returns true or false. Unfortunately, we cannot use a measure that returns a Boolean value as a filter in the filter pane. So we need to cast it to an integer where 1 stands for true and 0 stands for false. So I just create the item filter measure. And then on the slicer, let's get rid of it, we place a filter. And we say that on this visual, we want item filter to be equal to 1. That is true. As soon as we apply the filter, nothing happens here, but when I click on the user, you see that only see the items for Alberto, and this shows only the items which are visible for Marco. So that's a different technique that requires DAX code only because we cannot create the relationship. As you have seen, depending on the model you have, depending on the goal you have, you might solve the problem of filtering items in a slicer without writing any line of DAX code, or if you cannot create the relationship, then you will need to write some simple piece of DAX code. The code by itself is very simple. It just uses values, selected values, and then in to check whether a value is present in the selection or not. But this kind of simple DAX code oftentimes makes the report much more usable. Enjoy DAX!